Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I am Rebecca Hartwell, the developmental editor behind Heartbound Editing. It is my goal to help authors turn their stories into bestsellers or masterworks that can change their worlds. Today's guest is Jena Doyle, the author of the Royal Bastards and Midsummer series, both of which I am very excited to talk to her about on this episode. Hello, Jena.
Hello, Rebecca. How are you today?
I am doing just fine, thank you. Why don't you tell us and our listeners a little bit about who you are as an author and both of the series that we will be talking about today?
Thank you. So I am Jena Doyle. I've been writing probably all of my life. I have two motorcycle club series. The first one is Steel Roses. That's the one that I started publishing, and I'm still dabbling in that one a little bit. This year I released my Midsummer series. It's a queer poly adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream. And then I just started releasing in the Royal Bastards Motorcycle Club universe. It's a shared world. My chapter is in Helena, Montana, and the first one for that is called Blood and Whiskey.
Awesome, very cool. So I got to critique one of the Royal Bastards books, the Blood and Whiskey, which was so much fun. It is such a cool world that you've built, and I love the romance that you had between your protagonists. I would love to hear a little bit more about what a shared world is and how that's worked for you.
Yeah. So a shared world is a bunch of authors that write within that specific world, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about the same characters, although sometimes it can. The Royal Bastards is a international motorcycle club in this world, and different authors pick up different chapters within the world itself. I had the very good fortune of being seated next to Crimson Sin at Smut Lovers 2023. And at first, I had to like get over my fangirlness a little bit. I had not realized I'd read a couple of her books, but I had not realized that she was actually the creator of the Royal Bastards world. And so once I, put on my extroverted mask, I asked her, how do I get into that world? And she said, well, I created it. And I said, oh, okay. At the time, so at the beginning of the signing, she had said that she didn't have any space for me in 2024 and that it would probably be 2025. And I was like, fantastic, no worries. Like, just let me know as soon as I can get in. And then by the end of the signing, she was like, look, I can probably make space for you in September if you think that you can do that. And I said, yes, ma'am. Thank you so, so much. I love you. You're the best.
Awesome.
And so I was very fortunate to be able to get into that the shared world. As far as how it's worked out for me, it's been great. I know that there are some authors that think that it's too much work to be in a shared world. You do have to, make sure you're keeping up with the shared branding and, part of the benefit of being so connected to other authors is that you can cast a wider net, but that also means that you have to be putting your own net out as well. So, everybody in the world, all of the participating authors, anytime there's a new release, we have to promote that new release, which is fine because I'm always about promoting new books, especially if I can help other indie authors while I'm doing it. Um, which means that when it came my turn for my release, the net was so wide that I did very, very well. It was actually my best release out of all of the books that I have published. And so, and of course it sells your backlist too, right? So as an indie author, anytime I can point readers to anything else I've written, that's always a good benefit as well. So people read Blood and Whiskey, they liked it, and if they decided they wanted to read more, they went out and they got Steel Roses. Some people even went out and got Midsummer as well. So it's been very beneficial for me, and I am planning on doing another Royal Bastards Motorcycle Club romance next year.
So cool. So how does that work on the craft side of stuff? Are you given a world Bible or a series Bible to write to? Do you have to check it past anyone to make sure that it fits what the series organizer is going for? How does that work on like the writing side?
So Crimson gave me probably about a 5 minute overview of, here is the name of the motorcycle club. Here are the villains, which I had read a couple of them. So I was already pretty familiar with, okay, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys. And then you have to network with two other published author or two other chapters, right? And whether that's just like, hey, I need a doctor to come out to my chapter. Does anybody have a doctor in their motorcycle club? And oh yeah, my doctor's name is so and so, and he can come out and that sort of thing.
Huh.
There's certain rules about if your club is going to go in another club's territory, you have to like have that president know that they're there, right? Which just gives you it gives you an option to gives you an opportunity to have other characters that the readers already know and love show up in your books. And then when they see them, you get that little spark of like, oh, I read his book just last year. And look at him being in Montana. Like, what are you doing here? And so um yeah, so aside from the networking rules, and then aside from just having to adhere to the branding and the name of the character, like the name of the motorcycle clubs, it was pretty much, come up with whatever you want to. When I first started writing it, it was just going to be contemporary. It wasn't going to be paranormal. And then it started to feel very much like my other motorcycle club series, the Steel Roses. And so, especially with like the rival gang and the territory wars and that kind of stuff. And so I said, I don't want to just rewrite the same thing I've already written. How can I make this different? And it just so happened that I was reading a werewolf fanfic at the time. And so I was like, werewolves, right? Shifters. I love shifters. Like, let me just put that in there. And that really was the differentiator. Like once I did that, then I was, able to come up with something more original. And fortunately, it is not the only paranormal chapter in the Royal Bastards universe. So we can even like compare how my shifters are different than some of the other shifters in some of the other chapters.
Cool. I was about to ask, like, did you have to get permission to change the genre that much? But that's so cool.
Yeah, no, not really. There's a chapter in Dallas, and I apologize. The name of the author who writes that chapter is escaping me. It might be Christine Allen. Her shifters are more magically like just able to snap their fingers and shift into
Mhm.
their shifter form. Which and having read that in my werewolf universe, in my werewolf lore, it's very much like a breaking down of the body, and it takes place over the course of 5 or 10 minutes, where transformation is really painful. And so I was able to play with those differences and just have the magic be different. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to do. I'm really thankful to Crimson for giving me a spot. But then also just being so open and so lovely about allowing that creativity and that freedom to do whatever you want.
Nice. I loved how you described the shifting in your books. I've read and edited other werewolf novels, and that one really stood out to me. Did the inspiration for that kind of transformation come from anywhere in particular for you?
Oh yeah. So when I a couple years ago I listened to a talk at RWA. May they rest in peace, or maybe may they rest in not so much peace, considering the controversy. But I listened to a talk from a Dr. Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and she gave the suggestion of anytime you come across something that you really really like, write it down. It's called an id list, right? It's based on like ego and id, and the id is like the animal drive. Like her theory is that people like fiction because it's cheesecake, and there's no other reason for storytelling other than the fact that it's yummy and we like it. And that's why tropes exist, right? Like you read something and you like it, and so you're like, I need to go out and read 100 other stories that are exactly like this but different. And so what I did is every time I write a new story or I'm starting a new series, I'll write down or I'll go through my id list, and I'll say, okay, like I liked this, I liked this, I liked this. Let's see how much of this id list can I put into one book.
Nice.
And so I took my werewolf tropes from a bunch of different places. The transformation itself, the breaking down of the body and like the shifting and the cracking of the bones came from Hemlock Grove, which is a 3-season series on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. It's very gory, it's very hard. Like if you don't like blood and guts, stay far away. But there is a scene where one of the characters transforms into a werewolf, and it very much is like that. Like there's a very graphic scene of like the werewolf head coming out of his mouth, like coming out of his face, and he, you know, his bones crack in order to make the legs of the werewolf, and he sort of like shakes, and all of a sudden his skin comes off, and then he's a wolf. And so very, again, very gory, very bloody, but it stuck with me because at the time, and this was a couple years ago, at the time I was like, wow, those special effects for Netflix, because Netflix was like little bitty at the time. This was still when Blockbuster was around. And so I was like, wow, Netflix is getting some money. Like, yeah. So it's always stuck with me. It's one of my favorite shows. It's got a really young Bill Skarsgård in it, who I love. And so I took some of that. I am a big fan of J.R. Ward's Black Dagger Brotherhood series. And so the transition from like normal human into having the werewolf magic, I kind of took from Black Dagger Brotherhood. There is some pack dynamics in Nalini Singh's Psy Changeling series that I really liked, specifically about how the magic of the shifting works. Like everything's sort of centralized around the alpha, and he's the center point. And then, you know, you can pull the magic from the alpha or pull from each other. And then let's see, there were a couple of other influences as well that are escaping me right now. But I took all of my favorite werewolf tropes, anything that was on that id list, and I put it in a blender and then just like hit puree. And then what came out was what was in Blood and Whiskey. So I'm excited to get to explore that a little bit more in the next book as well.
That's so cool. I use a very similar thing myself, but I didn't have a name for it. I also have a list of I think I have it separated as plot points that I could just use somewhere or description points that I could just use somewhere. And I do the same thing when I go to write a book. I go through the list. I'm like, oh, I could use that here. Oh, I could use that here. I love that approach.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm
Dr. Jennifer Lynn Barnes, she is a doctor of like fiction psychology. Like she studies the psychology behind storytelling and why we create fiction. She's got a couple of bestsellers herself, but she has a lot of really good theories on why we like fiction and why certain tropes do so well, right? Like the Beauty and the Beast trope. Why does that just continue to pop up over history? So check her out just as a writer, and listeners out there, if you're interested in why you are so addicted to enemies to lovers, she's got some good theories on that.
I'm definitely going to be looking her up after this because I love that sort of meta fiction looking at why it works the way it works.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
great.
I'm also fascinated to hear that your inspiration came from Hemlock Grove because I did not make it far into that before. I'm like, this is too gory. And yet
Yes.
I can read the goriest stuff on the planet and I'm fine and I like it and it's visceral, but I like trying to watch it having the actual visuals. I'm like, I can't, I'm sorry. So
Uh,
I'm
I
glad that you took that and turned it into book form that I can consume.
Yes, yeah. I have a friend who really likes the horror trope. She was at the time she was really into zombies, and so I thought, okay, well, like werewolves are kind of close to zombies, right? Like they're all, especially these kinds of werewolves that want to like the werewolves in Hemlock Grove, or at least some of the werewolves like want to eat people, and so I thought maybe she would like it. And the very first scene is a very gory murder scene. And like I said, it's bloody and it's gory and it's very visceral. And she like we watched the first 5 minutes. She was like, nope, I'm done. I'm done. I don't want to. So I was like, wow, I can tolerate something and you can't. Okay. Like
To each their own, and I'm glad that
all
there's
right.
something out there for everyone's taste.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
So you'd mentioned that the Royal Bastards has chapters everywhere. It's an international thing. What made you choose to write about Montana and the part of Montana that you chose and those cultures?
So when we looked at the map of Royal Bastards chapters that currently exist, it's very concentrated on the coasts, right? Like
Mm.
much like population in general, the American population. And so Crimson had said, pick a chapter. She's trying to like not have chapters over like on top of each other, basically. Like there's a chapter in Baltimore and then another one in Washington, D.C. And she's like, that's really close. Like, how do you go onto their territory? Like they would just have to interact a lot. And so she's like, pick a chapter where there isn't anybody yet. And so I looked at the map and saw Montana, and I happened to be watching Yellowstone at the time. And so I was like, you know what? I can definitely work with that. So I was very fortunate to have you as one of my critique partners too, because, you had mentioned, at least in your feedback, that you had grew up, I don't know, on a ranch or like
Yep.
around horses on a farm type thing.
Yep.
And so I was able, at least some parts I got right. There were a few parts where you were like, hey, horses don't do that. And I was like, oh, good to know. Let me just delete that out of there. Like,
It's interesting having that the background that I do growing up on a horse ranch in Nevada because I'll read some stories like yours. I'm like, oh, she got the tone like pretty good. There's a couple little things that that's not really how that works. But overall, it's really solid. And then other times, unfortunately, I'll be reading through a manuscript. I'm just like, oh God, please stop. This is terrible. That's not how any of this works. So to your credit, your book was 99% spot on, which I really enjoyed. And having mentioned Yellowstone just now, I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally see the overlap there. There's lots of sort of tonal and cultural overlaps there that I think worked really well in your story.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. That was another influence. The Sons of Anarchy is always an influence for my motorcycle clubs, right? When I go to book signings and I'm trying to sell Blood and Whiskey, I say it's a crossover between Yellowstone and Sons of Anarchy if there were more werewolves. And so
I
people
love
that
that.
they're always like, tell me more.
So, what drew you to write about motorcycle clubs? Because you mentioned your original series was also in that trope and that genre. Was it just reading that genre that got you into it, or was there other influences?
It was reading the genre. When I first started writing the Steel Roses, I was also in the middle of writing Midsummer.
Mm.
I've been writing Midsummer. So Midsummer is a 4-book series. I wanted to finish the series before I started writing or publishing it so that I could have a cohesive story arc through all 4 books. But I'm not the type of person where I can just sit down and write 4 books. Like I need a palate cleanser in between to like break up the monotony almost. And not to mention writing about the same 4 characters for 4 books. Like by the end of book 4, I was like, you chuckleheads just need to get it together, right? So I needed a palate cleanser. Yeah, I was reading some Motorcycle Club. I was reading Jena Darling. I was reading some of the Royal Bastards like Crimson Sin and Nikki Landis, watching Sons of Anarchy. I grew up, my father used to custom paint motorcycles when I was a kid. And so I kind of grew up adjacent to the motorcycle club lifestyle, the biker lifestyle. Some of the people in Steel Roses are based off of people I either knew as a little kid or know now. Some of the people in Motorcycle Club are in Steel Roses are based off of, like, one of them is based off of my father. He's a side character, right? Like he's not involved in any romantic relationships. He appears in the background, right? But so some of it was pulled just from my childhood. Some of it was pulled from other books. There is a scene. Do you watch Euphoria? Have you seen Euphoria?
No, I haven't.
There's a scene in season 2 where the drug dealer, his name is Fez, he's at a party with all of the kids, and there's one character whose name is Lexi, and she's a like a little bit of a nerd, like almost like a goody two shoes. And they sit on a couch, and like for the whole party, those two talk, right? And they come from very different backgrounds, and the image of the two of them together, sort of like this nerdy goody two shoes girl and this drug dealer who's from a very, colored background. The image of those two together really stuck with me. And I was like, I ship them immediately. Like, I need them to have the best romantic relationship ever. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen now because the actor who played Fez unfortunately passed away. So rest in peace. But I took some of that, and that's my first scene in Crimson Chaos. Is we have a nerdy ex-librarian cam girl who is trying to find some help for her website, and she meets a biker who's at the party to sell pot to people, and they have a good conversation, and one thing leads to another. And so that I pulled from a number of different places, and mashed it all up, and that's what came out. So I think there's different sides to every personality. There's definitely a side of me that's much more like the Midsummer, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's more like fairies and like Shakespeare and literature and adaptation. And then there's a side that likes that Hemlock Grove, like the violence and the gore and the bad guys. And I saw a meme the other day that was like, why do I have the same taste in men as the correctional facility? And I was like, yes.
That's so solid for your genre too.
Yes. So yeah, so I think it just appeals to that. I don't call my motorcycle club books like dark romance because they're not bullies. There's no like Stockholm syndrome. I don't write about non-consent. Um and so I call them like gunmetal gray. Like it's not pitch black, it's not obsidian. You're not gonna walk away with like a long laundry list of content warnings, but there are some things in there that could make you a little squeamish. So
I love that description. That is so much fun. So I would love to talk to you a little bit more in depth about your process. We've talked a lot about inspiration. So are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? How do you approach the stories, having gone through your id list and pulled out the bits that you want to do? What is your process for getting them in order and making them coherent and then drafting?
yeah. So I am a little bit of a plantser. I do start out with an outline. So I work off of a 5-act structure. And it's kind of similar to, I think, Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes has 4 acts. And I add a final act just to set up the next book. And so I work with the 4 acts. So I open up my document, and I've got 4 folders or 5 folders of the acts. And then I go through and put vibes for each scene, right? Like so usually it's just a sentence or like one word to indicate what I want to happen in that scene, or the vibe that I get, what movie montage am I seeing in my head when I think about that scene. I would say like it's 50-50 on whether it actually stays that way as I start writing it. I do write in order. I can't jump around. I know some people can like, oh, well, I'm feeling this scene today, so I'll go do this or do that. I try to start from the beginning and go all the way to the end. Um, and then I try to stick to the beats as much as I can, right? So 25% of the way through, I write a fast, well, not so much in Blood and Whiskey. On my other books, on all of my other books, with the exception of that one, it's always a fast sexual burn and a slow emotional burn. So by 25%, my characters should have at least, seen each other masturbate, or should have at least done some kind of foreplay. And then by 50%, they should be screwing and starting to realize that they're falling in love with each other without, having said the words yet. And then by 75%, they should have already had their, getting close to like the Dark Knight, and something bad's going to happen. In a Jena Doyle book, for the most part, by 75%, one or both of them is going to have a run-in with the bad guy, and they're going to get taken, and something bad is going to happen to them. And then it's up to the other one to come save them, right? Or save themselves. Sometimes I've had the heroine be the badass out of the relationship, and she's the one who ends up saving everybody. And so,
I love it.
yeah. um, and so, and then of course, that'll get you through the first 4 acts. And then the act 5 in my structure is tie in the pretty bow, right? Like, okay, let's get to the resolution. Everybody's happy. They love each other now. And then how do I set up the next book? So, and I always do an epilogue. Some people's opinions vary on epilogues. Mine is always a slice of life so that you know, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, they're happy, right? And it's not necessarily that they have a baby. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but there is always like a return to domestication. There's always a return to, you know, life goes on and life is good for them. I know some people do an epilogue and they like put the next character, like the book they're going to write about next, into that. For me, that feels like you're getting me invested in another story that is not there yet. And especially if you are releasing the book and I'm reading it as soon as you release it, then when I get that next character, I want it now and you don't have it yet. And so now I'm like, it's 50-50 whether I'm going to come back and pick up the next book. So I don't know. For me, a slice of life epilogue just like puts a little end cap on it and makes it happy. And so, yeah, so I write it all the way through, and then I pause it for a week, 2 weeks, work on something else. Then I come back, then I read it again. Then I have a couple of beta readers that are my go-tos, and they read it. Then it goes through line edits. Well, it comes back, I rewrite it again, I reread it again. Then it goes to line edits, then it goes to proofs. And then before I publish, I do one final read through on my Kindle. And that's just a final, like, oh, I don't like that word, or oh, like my proof or my line editor changed that. I didn't realize it. I don't like that. Oh, there's a typo there. Nobody caught it. Let me get that. And so one final read through. And then at that point, I've read it so many times that I hate everything about it. And so I just publish it.
Yeah, that's a little too relatable.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you have a few beta readers that are your go-tos, and I know that you and I actually met through a critique partners group that has since died off for the most part. What sort of prompts do you give your beta readers? What is your expectation from them, and how do you help them fulfill it?
So I have worked with the same people that I met at that same critique group for a couple of years now. I think it's going on 4 or 5 years now. So I know what I'm going to get from each particular person. I work with a person named Leslie Grace, so she hasn't published yet, but she will, hopefully, fingers crossed, in 2025. She is amazing for developmental edits and for catching that emotional arc of the character. And she will call me out if I don't go deep enough into the deep POV. If she's like, I see that he's doing this here, like, why is he doing this? I want to know why. Like, tell me what's going through his head. And so she'll catch stuff. She helps me really well with the plot arc. Then Maggie Sims is another person that was in our critique group, and she is really good with on the page, this doesn't make sense. Like, why, what does this line mean? And you know, she's not as high level as Leslie is. Leslie can always see the 1,000-foot view. Maggie is really good at seeing the details on the trees, and you know, what can we buff, what can we polish just to make the flow better. And then, of course, working with you was very, very insightful for me too. So I told you in feedback that, you know, not only did you help me with Blood and Whiskey, but I was publishing book 4 in Steel Roses at the time. That one's called Mischief Mayhem. And they both had the same problem, was that there was no emotional arc for the characters, right? Like they didn't have to overcome anything in order to be together. And that's like romance 101. Like it's so funny how you forget things like as you get into your publishing career and you write so many books. I mean, at this point I've probably written like 20. I haven't published 20. A lot of them died on my computer and they just that's where they live. um but you forget that like, oh yeah, like they're supposed to have a reason why they can't be together. And in some of my books that reason has just been that one of them gets taken by the bad guy and then they have to like overcome the trauma of that or whatever. But that can't be it for every single book. And so getting your feedback at the time that I got it, I still had time to update Steel Roses and really seed that sort of like, I in that book the conflict was that the female MC had lost a bunch of people, and so she was worried about like opening up to the male MC and eventually losing him, especially because he's the type of person that would like throw himself in front of bullets to save somebody else. And so I was able to sort of go back and seed that in. And so, working with you, like not only helped me with Blood and Whiskey, but helped me with other books as well. And definitely as I'm writing another Roses right now. And I'm like, oh, I got to remember to make sure I
I
give them a
love
reason to
to
hate
hear
each
it.
other. Like,
That is always one of my goals is not just to help that book, but to help the writer because God knows I had so many of those in my own work, especially in my first book, and I was so grateful to get feedback on things like that that now as I'm working on editing book 4 or 5 in this series, I just have this little voice in my head of, okay, remember to check that so and so pointed out. So I love to hear that any feedback that I've pointed out can help moving forward for the author. That is very much always the goal.
well, thank you again.
You're very welcome. It's honestly so much fun. I find it so fun to read through stories and just let everything kind of, mull over in the brain. And at some point I'll hit a moment going through it. I'm like, that's the issue.
uh,
And I can finally like figure it out because every author is so different.
oh
I'm
yeah.
pretty sure that you're the only author that I had to point out that specific thing on as this sort of overarching, like, hey, if you tweak that, it's going to be, that 80/20. If you do 20% of the work, you'll get 80% of the improvement sort of situation.
Yeah.
Every author has a different one, and I love the moment where I get to figure it out and make a note in that chapter and then go back up to the top and make the overarching note and then revisit it on the next read. It's so much fun. So
Yeah,
glad to
no,
hear it was helpful as well.
so great. Yeah, it was most helpful.
Awesome. So, would you say is the biggest thing that sets you apart in what you write compared to your closest comp titles? I know we've talked about you writing in a shared world, which is what I would love to hear the most about because you talked about taking it into the shifter space, but someone else had already done that. So, what do you feel sets your book apart from, anything? This you can talk about the Midsummer series or the Guns N' Roses, or sorry, the Steel Roses, is that what it's called?
Steel Roses, yeah.
But I'd most love to hear about that from the perspective of writing in the shared world.
So with Blood and Whiskey, I think what sets it apart from the other titles in the shared world is the spin on the shifter lore that we already had talked about. A lot of people, I think, it's very easy to just have your shifters be able to shift right into their animal form or their alter ego form, right? And I wanted to play with it being this very painful experience and sort of dreading having to go through it every single month. And the lead up to the moon is a big thing in Blood and Whiskey, right? It's like, oh, we're 10 days out. How do we feel then? Okay, well, now we're 5 days out. How do we feel then? And the animal gets closer to the surface and then sort of dissipates and then comes back to the surface and dissipates. Um, I also have ranchers in my series as well. And I think that a lot of the other books in the Royal Bastards universe are much more focused on the biker trope.
Mm.
They're a bit darker too. There's a lot more. I think in the motorcycle genre in general, we get these really ultra masculine alpha types that, you know, call the hangarounds like club sluts, and they might, when I'm reading a romance and when I'm writing a romance, I know this is, I'm not going to yuck anybody else's yum, right? I personally do not enjoy reading about a character who sleeps with somebody else in the book, right? Like I only want to hear about the person like liking the other main character. So I think in the motorcycle club uh genre, we see a lot of like the men like, hooking up with the club slut before he gets with the female, or you know uh I I try to limit as much of that as I possibly can, right? And so I think in the other Royal Bastards motorcycle clubs, you do get a lot of those like ultra masculine, like, if you even look at her the wrong way, I'm gonna shoot you in the head. And so, not to say that some of my characters aren't like that, because they do. I mean, there's an alpha, right? They have that animal drive, but going back to the dark versus the gunmetal gray thing, right? Like none of my characters are going to necessarily like do anything to the other main character without their consent. They're not going to be just so over the top. And I do get that like that is something that is part of the motorcycle club genre and people love it. And I totally understand that. It's not going to happen in a Jenna Doyle book, unfortunately. So
Fair. Well, I agree with you, and I very much appreciated how you balanced that alpha masculinity and still being having a feminist bent to it that I appreciate as a woman. I like reading through it. I've read other motorcycle club books in that sort of genre that did make me a little uncomfy, but yours never did, and I did appreciate that from start to finish.
thanks. Yeah.
So we've talked a fair bit about the biker stuff because that's what I've read, and so I'm a little bit keyed in on that. But I would love to hear a bit more about your Midsummer series. I love Shakespeare and I love fairies and all of that stuff. So
Yeah.
why don't you tell us a little bit of a blurb for the series and where your inspiration came from to start it and where it is now?
Sure, yeah. So Midsummer is a 4-book series. It's about the same 4 characters. It is queer, it is poly. I took the 4 lovers from Midsummer Night's Dream, and I asked myself what would have happened if those 4 people had just fucked in the woods instead of having all of this relationship drama. And so that's what I wrote. The first book is, well, I would say all of them are a little bit of enemies to lovers. 2 of the main characters are enemies. They're sort of rivals. And it takes place over the course of a 3-week stint at a theater retreat in Northern Ireland. So we're in the land of the fairies. We're in a very remote part of Ireland. It's a town that I made up that doesn't exist, but imagine like Derry, but then north of that. And so uh, it's, the main characters go into the woods on Midsummer for a Midsummer celebration and have a run-in with the fairies, and things sort of get very chaotic from there. I took my inspiration from a lot of different places. I started writing this during the pandemic. So this Midsummer is actually the first book recently that I have written. Like I said before, I've written a number of books before, but they will never see the light of day again. So this is one of the ones that I actually wrote and I was kind of proud of, and I did put some more work into it. At the time, I was reading a lot of Sierra Simone. So her new Camelot series I read and absolutely fell in love with. The first one is called American Queen. I plug it anywhere I can because you should read it. Everybody should read it. It should be required reading as soon as you start reading smut. Like that should be the first thing that you have to read as a smut reader. Then I was reading A Lesson in Thorns, which is her Thorn Chapel. That one. So American Queen is male, female, male, poly. And it's about a president, a vice president, and then the woman that is in between them. And so I plugged into that like political family piece. And then Thorn Chapel is a 6-person poly relationship. And that is very, like in typical Simone fashion, it's very dark academia. Um, it's about the six people who come across like a ancient book and decide to go out into the woods and have this orgy and like enact the stuff that they found in the book. Which of course leads to other shenanigans. Also, very good book. Like she can't miss. She's amazing. And so I plugged into the poly aspect of that. As I was reading it, I was like, this kind of feels like a dark academia Midsummer Night's Dream. I was like, I wonder if there is a Midsummer Night's Dream adaptation out there. And if there isn't, like somebody should write that. And then I
Absolutely.
said, I guess I should write that. And so, so I set out to write it. And, I pulled from the presidential aspect of it in the book. The main character in Midsummer is the daughter of the first female president of the United States. I imagined that George Washington had a son, and then that sort of catapulted this line of royal Washingtons in America that they've had, multiple Washington presidencies. I'm from Maryland, I'm from Baltimore, and the Fairfaxes were a big family at the time that Washington was around. And so I imagined a Washington Fairfax alliance. There's a Washington or a Fairfax County in Virginia, right? It's a local name. There's lots of like Fairfax streets and things like that. And it's all from the Fairfax family at the time. And so my two main characters in Midsummer are Ivy Washington and Lex Fairfax. And those are the enemies and my enemies to lovers.
Nice.
And then, of course, if you're familiar with the play at all, it's about a girl who is already she's part of a very wealthy family, and her father up and decides that she's going to marry this other guy, Demetrius, and she's already with Lysander, and she's like, I don't want to marry Demetrius, and so she runs away with Lysander. Meanwhile, Demetrius was dating this other girl, Helena, and they broke up. Like Demetrius broke up with her when he was supposed to marry Hermia as the first girl, and Helena tells Demetrius that Lysander and Hermia have run away, and so Demetrius runs after them, and then Helena's like, well, "Wait for me," and runs after them too. And so, like,
This sounds like so much fun to reread in your imagining. I love the modern takes on stuff, and that sounds like so much fun chaos.
I was perplexed by the fact that Demetrius doesn't get a good opportunity to explain himself. And so he comes off
Mm.
as kind of this jerk who just throws one girl away when another opportunity presents itself. And so I started to think more about like, why would he do that? What would be the cause of that? And that's how I came up with my Lex character. Lex is influenced by a lot of different media that I consume, most notably Roman Godfrey from Hemlock Grove, right? Like that's I think probably my biggest influence on Lex's character. He's very pratty, very spoiled, very like just so nihilistic, doesn't give a crap what anybody thinks about him. And then Ivy is very much influenced by well, I guess a lot of my own life is sort of influenced by her. I mean, of course, I'm not the daughter of some president, but she's very stubborn. She's very like goody two shoes, total mommy issues. Like she's just like, she hates the fact that her mom controls her life, and yet she does very little to try to take control of it herself, at least initially in the first book. And so, um,
I love that so much of what you're describing just sounds like great setups for conflict and tension and chaos and shenanigans, both of which
oh
words you've already used, and I love those. So the book you're about to release, is that book 2 in the series then?
Yes, so book two, Samhain, comes out on October 29th. So the first two book is Ivy and Lex's point of view. All four characters are there, but it's just their point of view.
Mhm.
And so the next book will be Carter and Miri's point of view. And Miri is an English princess, sort of like a Prince Harry, like a gender swapped Prince Harry type person.
Fun.
And then Carter is, while he's dealing with all of these, rich royal people, he's middle class, like he's from very humble beginnings. And so his story is all about like, he's my Lysander character. He's the one who's like not good enough to be married to our Hermia person. And so what does that feel like, right? So that one will come out in October, like end of October, but it's not a standalone. You have to read Midsummer in order to understand what's going on in Samhain and all the way through.
You have me very excited to read that, so I'll have to bump the first Midsummer book up my reading list. It is already on there. I just need to bump it
Yes.
up. And I'm absolutely going to look up some of the other authors that you've mentioned today. You do a good job of selling me on the authors that you
Oh
tell me about.
man. I try to get everybody I can to read Sierra Simone. She's so sweet. So the little tangent, right? My Midsummer book is influenced a lot by the American Queen and Thornchapel. So Maggie Sims actually encouraged me to reach out to her to see if I could get a cover quote to put on it, right? Um, Sierra Simone is too busy for me, right? Like let's just be honest, she's amazing. She's doing all these wonderful things and she's too busy for little old me. And so she wrote back and wrote me a very, very sweet email. It was like, I am too busy. I can't promise you anything because I won't be able to commit to it. Totally understandable, but it was so encouraging. And she was just like, keep writing and keep following your passions and keep writing about all the things that you want to write about. And like, I'm even blushing just thinking about it. Like, she was so amazing. So now I just have the best experience and the best like opinion of her. And so I tell everybody read her books
I
because they're
love that so much. When I was early in my author career, I reached out to an author in the space, Olivia Atwater. No,
Mhm.
yes, Atwater, not Atwood. Olivia Atwater. And yeah, she was so encouraging, and she sent me this whole email that like gave me the next steps for getting published and edited and all this stuff. And she was amazing. And big, big props to all of the indie authors and trad authors out there who take the time to help us little guys who are just getting
Help the
started.
little baby authors. Yeah.
So it has been wonderful talking to you, Jenna. Thank you so much. Before we head off, where can people find you and your books on the World Wide Web?
Sure. So I'm wide. I am everywhere except for Google Play right now. I'm working on Google Play. Their platform is very tricksy, so I'm trying to navigate that. But hopefully, fingers crossed soon. You can find me on all of the social medias at the Jena Doyle. And my website is jenadoyle.com. I have links on my website to all my books. So if you go there, you can find them. I also have a couple of free stories on there too. So if you're curious and you want to test the water before diving headfirst, come check out some of my free stuff.
I love it. And I will be sure to put all of those links for our listeners in the podcast descriptions when I post those. Thank you again so much for coming on, and I already look forward to reading more of your stories and possibly chatting again in the future. I hope you have
Thank
a
you
great
so much
day.
for having me. And thank you again for all your help. I really appreciate it.
You're very
It's
welcome.
been great.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make a good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.